What if you could let go of someone so completely, so suddenly, that your own mind froze in shock, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood something Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to warn us about? Detaching fast is not a trick. It is not a coping mechanism. According to Jung, it is the most psychologically honest thing a human being can ever do. And when you do it correctly, it does not feel like relief. It feels terrifying. It feels like something is being ripped out of you, because something is. Today, we are going deep into Jung's most powerful and most misunderstood process. Detachment so complete, so instant, that it changes the architecture of your personality forever. By the end of this video, you will understand why people who master this become almost impossible to control, and why those who refuse it stay prisoners their entire lives. This is not motivational content. This is psychological surgery. Jung was very clear. The knife has to go all the way in. Let us start with something most people get completely wrong. When people talk about detachment, they usually mean distance, going cold, blocking someone's number, unfollowing them online, keeping busy so you stop thinking about them. That is not detachment. That is suppression. And suppression, Jung said, is one of the most dangerous things a human being can do to themselves. Jung observed this constantly in his clinical work in Zurich. Patients came convinced they had moved on. New relationships, new routines, new cities. But beneath the surface, the same patterns, the same fights, the same invisible chain. Jung called this the repetition compulsion. They had never detached. They had just relocated their attachment. Real detachment, Jung said, does something different entirely, and it starts with one word: projection. Right now, the people you are most attached to are not entirely real to you. That sounds strange, so let me explain. When you fall deeply in love with someone, when their approval feels like oxygen and their rejection feels like death, it is almost never entirely about them. Jung discovered that in these moments, we are doing something automatic and unconscious. We are projecting. Think of a film projector in a dark cinema. The screen on the wall is blank. No color, no story, no emotion. But the projector behind you is throwing an image onto it. Imagine you walk up and try to touch the image. You reach out for the face, the color, the beauty. Your hand just touches flat white wall. That is what is happening in your most intense attachments. The person you cannot stop thinking about, the one whose words echo in your head at 3 in the morning, they are partly the screen. But the image you see on them, the depth, the meaning, the feeling that they complete you or destroy you, that image is coming from inside of you. It is your own unconscious material, your unlived potential, your unhealed wounds projected outward onto another person. Jung called this participation mystique, a state of psychological fusion where you cannot tell where you end and the other person begins, the root of almost every form of emotional suffering. Here is what changes everything. But first, one level deeper. Because Jung did not stop at projection in general. He identified the specific psychological structure behind the most devastating attachments. He called it the anima and the animus. Every person, Jung argued, carries an inner image of the opposite. Men carry an internal feminine figure, the anima, built from every emotional experience, every longing, every dream and wound that never found an outlet. Women carry the animus, an internal masculine figure, constructed from the same unintegrated psychological material. It is worth noting that Jung developed these ideas in the early 20th century, and modern Jungian practitioners have expanded his framework. Today, many view the anima and animus not as strictly gendered structures, but as universal soul images, the inner carrier of the qualities each individual has not yet integrated into their conscious identity. Regardless of gender, Every person carries an inner psychological counterpart built from their unique emotional history. One that they will inevitably project outward when the conditions are right. These inner figures are not conscious. You did not build them deliberately. They formed in the dark over years, shaped by your earliest emotional experiences, your parents, your losses, your fantasies. When you meet someone who resembles that inner figure even slightly, your unconscious does something automatic. It collapses the distance between the inner image and the outer person. It says, "This is the one. This is who completes what is missing in me." That feeling of instant recognition, that overwhelming sense that this person was made for you, that terrifying magnetic pull you cannot explain rationally. Jung said that is almost never entirely about the actual person in front of you. It is your own soul image, projected outward. You are falling in love with yourself without knowing it. This is why certain attachments feel impossible to escape. You are not attached to a person. You are attached to the most intimate image your own unconscious has ever created. Breaking that attachment does not feel like leaving someone. It feels like amputating part of your own soul. Which is exactly why, when you finally do it correctly, the recognition happens so fast. The moment you see the projection clearly, the real person and the soul image split apart. You cannot unsee it. The circuit breaks, and the weight that had been crushing you begins to lift. But here is what Jung was careful to clarify. The snap of recognition is fast. The integration of what comes back to you is not. That is the actual work. Slow, demanding, often painful. The lightning bolt of awareness is only the beginning. What follows is a long, honest reckoning with everything you had placed in someone else's hands. The incision happens fast. The healing takes time. If the intensity of your attachment is largely built on projection, then real detachment has nothing to do with the other person at all. Real detachment means taking your projection back, withdrawing the image from the screen. When you do that, you do not slowly fade away from someone. The recognition snaps you back into yourself. That is why it feels so fast. That is why it scares your own mind. Consider a case profile that illustrates this dynamic clearly. Think of a composite patient we will call Elena, representing a pattern Jung observed repeatedly. She had been in a relationship for 4 years. She described her partner as her other half, the person who made her feel alive. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. When the relationship ended, Elena did not come to therapy devastated in the way most people expected. She came in almost catatonic. She felt as if she no longer existed, as if a part of her had been physically removed. Jung's insight in cases like this was not that the love was false. The love was real. But the weight of it came from something else entirely. Elena had projected her own creative potential, her own sense of worth, her own unexplored identity onto her partner. She had handed him the most valuable parts of herself. When he left, she experienced it as a kind of psychological amputation. Jung's approach was not to help her grieve the loss of him. It was to help her recognize what belonged to her all along. And when that recognition hit, Elena described it in a way Jung noted as remarkable. She said it felt like the floor fell out from under her attachment, not slowly, all at once. That is the moment. That is the snap. Jung called this process the withdrawal of projection. It is the mechanism behind what we are calling scary fast detachment. But before we go further, we need to understand why this is so terrifying, because it genuinely frightens people, and understanding why is what will allow you to do it anyway. When you have been projecting a significant part of yourself onto another person, that person has been carrying a piece of your soul for you, your unlived life, your potential, your sense of meaning. This is why certain people feel irreplaceable. This is why certain losses feel like they will kill you. The pain is not an exaggeration. You are losing the container that was holding part of your psyche. Jung wrote about this in his work on individuation. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming fully yourself, integrating the split-off and projected parts of your psyche into a coherent whole. Not a destination, a continuous act of reclamation. Every time you withdraw a projection, you reclaim a piece of yourself you had unknowingly given away. But here is what makes people freeze. When you withdraw the projection, you are suddenly holding it yourself. All that intensity, all that longing, all that meaning. It stops living out there in another person and starts living inside you. Now, you are responsible for your own depth. You can no longer outsource your sense of completion. This is exactly why Jung said, most people refuse to do it. It is easier to stay attached, even to something painful, than to fully own the psychological contents the attachment was carrying. Now let us get to the mechanics, because Jung did not just describe the problem. He developed a method. It starts with what we can call objectifying the subjective. Your emotions, if you are attached to someone in a way that feels out of your control, feel deeply personal and real. They feel like the truth about the situation. Jung's first move was to challenge that assumption completely. He taught his patients to step back from their emotional experience and look at it the way a scientist looks at a specimen under glass. Not to dismiss the emotion, not to deny it, but to examine it as an external object rather than an internal truth. This is the technique. When you feel the pull towards someone, the obsessive thinking, the craving for their attention, the fear of their rejection, instead of living inside that feeling, you observe it. You step outside it. You say, there is a feeling of intense longing arising in me right now. That is a different relationship to the emotion than saying the emotion is the truth about reality. The moment you do this successfully, something strange happens. The emotion does not disappear, but it loses its grip on your behavior. You are no longer inside the storm, you are watching it. And a storm you can observe is one you can survive without being destroyed. Jung described this as achieving psychological distance through consciousness. The key word is through, not around, not away from. You go directly into awareness, and that awareness itself creates the separation. This is why it happens fast, because awareness is instant. The second you genuinely see your projection, not as a concept, but as a lived recognition, the attachment begins to dissolve. There is a before and an after. Now we need to talk about the shadow, because without this piece, the detachment will be temporary at best. Jung spent decades developing his concept of the shadow. Put simply, the shadow is everything about yourself that you have rejected, denied, or refused to look at. Every impulse you were taught was unacceptable. Every desire you buried, every quality you despise in others that you quietly carry yourself. But Jung made a distinction most people miss. The shadow is not only dark. He also identified the golden shadow, the unlived positive potential we cannot yet claim for ourselves. Suppressed creativity, unacknowledged courage, an unused capacity for joy or brilliance that we have decided does not belong to us. We project both. We project dark shadow onto people we resent or fear, and we project golden shadow onto people we idolize, seeing in them the greatness or aliveness we have not yet claimed as our own. This is why the Elena profile rings true. She had not projected need alone onto her partner. She had projected her own creative worth, her own unlived identity. Reclaiming it was not about admitting darkness. It was about claiming the capable, vibrant parts of herself she had never dared to own directly. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The people we become most desperately attached to are almost always carrying some piece of our shadow, dark or golden. We are drawn to people who embody what we have suppressed. The overly responsible person falls for the wild one. The person who buried their anger falls for someone fearless. The person who silenced their needs falls for someone magnificently self-centered. We look at them and feel something magnetic that does not quite make rational sense. That magnetism is projection recognizing its own material. When you begin to withdraw your projections and own your shadow directly, you become dramatically less manipulable. The mechanisms people use to keep you attached and compliant, the guilt, the idealization, the fear of abandonment, only work because you are projected out. The moment you come home to yourself, they stop working. This is the moment Jung described as genuinely dangerous, not for the person who has reclaimed themselves, but for every dynamic that depended on their unconsciousness. The person who has withdrawn their projections becomes psychologically sovereign. They can still love, they can still engage, but they do it from conscious choice rather than compulsion. That distinction changes everything. Now, there is a pitfall here that Jung was very specific about warning against, and it is important enough that we need to address it directly. Consider one more narrative illustration, a composite profile from the kind of case Jung documented in his later clinical work. Picture someone who came to understand projection intellectually. They read about it, could explain it to others, could identify it in everyone around them, but they could not apply it to themselves. Jung called this the most common failure in the individuation process. Intellectual understanding without lived experience. A person can know that projection exists the way they know that gravity exists. But knowing it and feeling the ground come up to meet you are two entirely different things. In this type of case profile, the breakthrough never came from another explanation. It came from a moment of silence. Jung documented how patients like this would sit with a memory of the person they were attached to, and he would ask one question: which of the qualities you most love in this person do you most deny in yourself? That question landed like a stone dropped into still water. The answer was always there. The admired courage was their own suppressed courage. The magnetic freedom was their own caged freedom. The enviable authenticity was the authenticity they had been performing rather than living. The projection did not disappear, but it became visible, and a projection you can see is a projection you can take back. That is the moment the detachment happens fast. Not because the other person changes, because you finally recognize what you were actually looking at. Some people hear about projection withdrawal and use it to justify emotional shutdown. They decide that because attachments involve projection, all deep feeling is illusion. They become proud of their coldness. They wear detachment as armor. Jung was clear. This is not individuation. This is the flight from life. Avoidance wearing the costume of wisdom. Real detachment does not make you cold. It makes you clear. You can love more fully when you are not projecting, because you are loving an actual person rather than a screen. The love is no longer desperate or possessive because you are no longer outsourcing your completeness to someone else. Jung believed the capacity for genuine love actually increases as individuation deepens. What decreases is compulsion. What disappears is the feeling that any particular person holds the key to your survival. And when that disappears, you become free in a way most people have never experienced. Think of someone you have met, perhaps only once or twice in your life, who had a quality of presence different from almost everyone else. Warm, but not anxious. Interested in you, but not dependent on your approval. They could receive criticism without collapsing and praise without inflating. Something in their eyes was steady in a way that was almost unsettling. Jung would say you were looking at someone significantly individuated, someone who had done the work of withdrawing projections over time. These people are not perfect. They have wounds and blind spots like everyone else, but their relationship to their interior life is fundamentally different. They are not at war with themselves, not running from their shadow, not dependent on external validation to feel real. And this quality, this groundedness, this undeniable presence is what makes them both deeply attractive and, to certain personalities, deeply threatening. People who rely on manipulation, on guilt, on the projection hooks of idealization and devaluation cannot get a grip on someone like this. The techniques do not stick. These individuated people become, in a very practical sense, dangerous to those whose power depends on others remaining psychologically asleep. This is observable interpersonal dynamics, explained by Jung decades before modern psychology had language for it. Now we come to the final question, the one that actually matters. Why does scaring your own mind save your soul? Because your mind, your everyday conscious ego, has one goal: comfort, familiarity, preservation of the status quo. Your ego wants things manageable and predictable. It does not want transformation. It does not want the radical disruption of seeing your projections clearly. When you withdraw a major projection, your ego does not know what to do. It registers the sudden return of that psychological energy as a kind of threat. It feels dangerous because it is new. It feels scary because nothing about it is familiar. But here is a distinction Jung was precise about. The fear belongs to the ego, not to you entirely. The ego is losing its grip on a familiar story, the story that explained your longings, your pain, your sense of purpose, by pointing outward at another person. That story is collapsing, and the ego experiences that collapse as terrifying. The self responds differently. As the projection withdraws and the ego panics, the self becomes more present, more grounded, more real. This is why people who go through genuine projection withdrawal often describe two things happening at once: a free-fall feeling, and underneath it, something solid that was always there, but could not be felt while the projection was in the way. This is the crucial difference between Jungian detachment and dissociation. Dissociation is a disappearing act. The self goes numb, goes away, goes offline. Jungian detachment is the opposite. It is a coming home. The ego is shaken. The self is finally present. Jung described this as the ego confronting the self. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It is deeper and larger than the ego, and it has a direction, an inherent pull toward wholeness, toward becoming fully what you are capable of being. Every time you withdraw a projection, you take one more step toward that wholeness. But the ego resists, because wholeness means something larger than your comfort is operating your life. That is the fear. That is why the mind gets scared, and that is precisely why it is necessary, because the alternative is not safety. The alternative is remaining attached to projections your whole life, chained to people and stories composed of your own unconscious material, never fully knowing yourself, never choosing from genuine freedom, living inside a psychological drama you authored but cannot remember writing. Jung's central message, the thread through every concept from the shadow to the anima, from projection to individuation, is this: you are not who you think you are. You are vastly more. And discovering that will scare the version of you that has been managing on projections and borrowed meaning. But on the other side of that fear is something Jung believed was the most important thing a human being could achieve. He called it becoming who you truly are, not who your parents needed you to be, not who your relationships shaped you into, not the person your wounds convinced you to become, but the actual integrated expression of your own psyche, conscious of its shadow, golden and dark, responsible for its projections, no longer at the mercy of compulsion. That person is free, not in the abstract philosophical sense, free in the lived moment-to-moment experience of their own choices, their own perceptions, their own emotions. The path to becoming that person starts with the most frightening act in all of psychology, taking back what belongs to you, not slowly, not carefully, not when you feel ready. Jung was emphatic. Readiness is another word for the ego waiting until it can maintain control. Real transformation does not wait for permission from your comfort zone. You take back your projection the moment you see it. You withdraw the image from the screen the moment you recognize that the depth you were seeing in someone else was, at least in part, the depth of your own soul looking back at you. In that moment, the attachment does not fade gradually. The recognition of it dissolves the distortion that was magnifying it beyond its actual weight. What the ego built over years, the self can see through in a moment, not because the other person no longer matters, but because you can finally see them clearly without your own projected soul laid over them like a second skin. What remains is real. What remains is yours. And you, for perhaps the first time, are fully home in yourself. That is the detachment that scares your mind. That is the freedom that saves your soul. If you have ever felt the ground shift beneath an attachment and known in that moment that something had permanently changed inside you, comment right now. I am reclaiming my power. Because that moment was real. And what you did in it was exactly what Jung described. You individuated, even if it frightened you. You came home to yourself. That is the work. That is the only work that matters. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.